Well, hello and welcome to the Psychedelic Diaries. I am your host, Ray Christian, and do we have a show for you today? Today, we will discuss lawsuits to legalize plant medicine, the challenges of large dose psychedelic sessions, and David Champion, CEO and co-founder of Maya Health, will be joining us momentarily for a deep dive and a soul search. Producer Kevin is here working hard to make sure this show gives you the warm and fuzzies, so please subscribe. And as usual, we'll start things off with a nugget and a noodle. In today's news nugget, more lawsuits for access to psychedelics. An Australian psychiatrist by the name of Dr. Eli Kotler is now suing the Victorian government for access to MDMA. And this comes on the heels of the state of Washington, as they have a lawsuit against the DEA for access. And it is inspiring to see people are so passionate about psychedelics that they don't want to wait for the legislative process, and instead seeing if the judicial system can help. So stay tuned on that one. And as for the noodle, something I've been noodling on of late is a world with moderate legal use of any drug you want. So Portugal and Oregon have shown us a path. And for me personally, I don't want to drink or use cannabis every single time I'd like to unwind. And perhaps it is good to occasionally mix in MDMA, psilocybin, ketamine, or even, God forbid, cocaine or Xanax. Now, I'm a fan of single issue politics. If you had to pin me down, I would say just legalize psilocybin. But maybe it's time to stop demonizing recreational drug use, especially if it gets us off this crippling addiction to alcohol. So a world with a cornucopia of mind-altering substance used moderately. Something to noodle on. Well, that's it for the nugget and a noodle. Producer Kevin, are we all properly synced up with David Champion? We are. Ladies and gentlemen, if I may direct your attention, he is the CEO and co-founder of Maya Health. David Champion, thank you for joining the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course, I'm excited to have you. You are one of my favorites in this space, David. And I just want to say, first off, thank you for being one of the tip of the spear guys that was part of the decriminalize Denver movement. And as we look back, it feels like that was a watershed moment that helped inspire, in large part, this psychedelic renaissance. So thank you for that, for being one of those guys. And I'm curious for you, that was early on. You guys were bold. Right now, this psychedelic renaissance is kind of, it's in the zeitgeist, but that time you were really ahead of the curve. What was that experience like for you?
Well, first of all, huge hat tip to Kevin Matthews, who spawned the idea and directed that campaign. He was truly fearless throughout, even when it seemed like the odds were all stacked against us. And I remember being in the very first little gathering of 8 or 10 of us that got together to discuss what this might look like and discuss what we could each bring to the initiative. And he really stepped into his power in that moment. And I could see him, having the training wheels on to be a leader, and then just letting them go and truly hearing what everyone wanted to bring to the campaign. He was more recently presenting to the city of Aspen, which I wonder if you've covered this on your show. Aspen is not city, but Aspen is looking to bring in some kind of psychedelic policy reform, and it's being discussed what that might look like. And Kevin presented, this was just 6 or 9 months ago, I think, and he put up a slide on screen that showed how many psychedelic specific companies existed in around 2018 when we started the work on the Decriminalize Denver campaign. And it was sort of like 1 or 2 logos. And then he goes to the next slide with the logos of the companies that have existed, that come about since then, just 2 years on, and the page was full, 100 plus logos. And not to say that Denver was the only catalyst for that, but it was certainly the first domino to fall in US policy, and clearly inspired so much else that's happened since then. So it's just an honor to have been part of that making of history. It was pure gut feeling that I love Denver. I love living here. And if I can be a part of making change, then then it was worth the time, and certainly was.
I appreciate that mention of that it looked dark at times, like it wasn't going to work, because when I saw that legalization news, it was for me a wow moment. I could not believe that it had happened. And it was especially exciting because Denver and Colorado has been a bellwether, or was a bellwether, for cannabis. So in terms of a canary in the coal mine, that was exciting. And I love that anecdote about there was 2 in 2018 and a full page later. We were doing the AI technology we built. And at that time, I was basically behind closed doors exploring psychedelics. And I saw the impact on anxiety, depression, mental health, and addiction. And that was our focus for this AI we built. So I had an analyst. I said, just look into that industry. What is out there? And it was 2018. And they came up completely empty. And I was thinking, you know what? I was pie in the sky. What am I thinking? It's going to be decades or a decade before something happens. And then 2 years later, I looked and I could not believe the development. So it's really cool to hear that story. And you were one of those. Maya is one of those companies. And you've got a kind of a CRM based approach, and you had similar success with this type of model in cannabis, and you're doubling down on it. And you've got, I think you said it's this measurement-based care approach. And I think you're offering it free to some of the institutions. And then for the larger research institutions, you're going to partner with them. Can you tell us a little bit about the focus and how you arrived on it?
Right, happy to. Maybe I will rewind back to Baker Technologies, which was the cannabis-focused CRM we started in 2014. And it's so interesting to be reminded of this by more than one friend. I had 2 different people recollect a moment in 2014 when they asked me why I was starting a cannabis-focused technology company as somebody who doesn't personally use cannabis. And I for sure could sort of share the emotional and emotive purpose of the company, which was to help bring more access to cannabis and safer consumption with more education, and the access for healing that's available with cannabis. And I believe all of that. But the truth was, and my friend reminded me of this, that what I said was, one day it'll be psilocybin. And I think if I can make a dent in the cannabis ecosystem, then I'll be in a really strong position to migrate on to psilocybin and maybe other psychedelics. And I also thought that was going to be 10 plus years at a minimum. And so that was 2014, 2018, Decrim Denver starts. And then 2019, I started the nonprofit research organization together with Del Jolly and Heather Jackson, Unlimited Sciences. So we partnered with Johns Hopkins, and that's when it started to become real, that we were really looking at data that could help inform mental health care. And with some of the publications emerging from universities in the psychedelic renaissance, that project took shape. We launched a psilocybin study that recruited 4,200 participants around the world. Anyone in any circumstance choosing to consume psilocybin was participating in science. And so we were gathering data from 4,200 people that was designed to start the conversation about what's important beyond the drug and the dosage, because the Western medical system focuses so clearly on pharmaceutical drug and dosage. And I think those of us coming into psychedelics from the unlicensed or non-medical, non-research side understand that there's so much more at play, right? This concept of set and setting, the concept of preparation and education, concept of integration, and more. These are quite well understood by individual practitioners, often in the gray market or underground, but less well understood by the research and medical ecosystem. And so the intention was to bridge that divide and help bring more awareness of those non-drug elements of the healing that's available from psychedelics. And that was what led to building Maya.
That's wonderful. And this idea, David, of the kind of guy that's playing 3D chess, and I think you're one of them. I didn't know that story, that in 2014 you weren't even using. You're not a connoisseur of cannabis, and yet you saw that that was going to be the canary in the coal mine. So you wanted to push for that, knowing that eventually that could kind of be the fullback that opens the hole up for the halfback, being psilocybin eventually. So thank you for being so forward thinking. That is inspiring to hear. And this concept of access, intentional use, for me, it really resonates, because my experience was, once I discovered that there was a different way to use psilocybin, it opened up a whole new world. And for me, it ended up being this intentional, quiet, introspective use of psilocybin magic mushrooms. And when I saw and started to realize the impact that it has on my creativity and my cognition, my sense of purpose, it fundamentally changed the trajectory of my life. And I'm curious, what has your journey with psychedelics been like?
Well, it's been a long span. I wasn't a teenager like many in this community, but I came to psychedelics in my mid-20s through social circles, and then was introduced by friends to this concept of intention setting and ceremony. And I had never really used any recreational drugs, more or less, and so all of it was new to me, and it was really captivating that friends of mine who were choosing to have an experience for pleasure, they weren't necessarily doing it for medical or therapeutic reasons, but still would guide us into a very ceremonial space, this almost ritualistic space, whether it was in nature or in a carefully chosen sort of city dwelling. The ability to come into a circle and hold the medicine in your hand, and each take it in turns to share an intention for what one hopes to experience, or what might come out of this journey, and to notice that time after time that intention came to life during the journey.
Yes.
And very, very clearly, on the occasions where I forgot or didn't make time to have that ceremony and set the intention, the experience sometimes was much less enjoyable, or in some cases a little dangerous, just because of the places that the psyche can take you. And I think that was the first kernel of awareness for me, that there was more to these experiences than popping a pill and getting a reliable experience from it. I think the moment that really opened my eyes to how important it is that we pay attention to that was I may not even share which compound I was on, but suffice to say, a classical psychedelic, and I had taken that same dose before. There was nothing unusual about the dose or the compound or even the source, but the experience after about 4 hours started to go very, very sideways. And for reasons unbeknownst to me at the time, I fell into a dissolution state where even putting my hand on the ground and trying to ground myself by telling myself that the ground is horizontal and what I'm touching is horizontal, therefore I'm safe, or therefore I'm in a familiar place, stable. And then I lost the concept of horizontal, and so that disappeared. And and this lasted for about 3 or 4 hours. And it was at night. It was in a busy place. I could have easily been hit by a car or had some other incident happen that would have jeopardized my safety. And that was a huge wake-up call for me. So as I started to sort of reemerge from that experience, I was speaking to a friend who's very wise in the field of psychedelics, and she let me know about this organization that's a subsidiary of MAPS. It's called Zendo. They do activations at festivals and at Burning Man, and they have training for people around the world to learn how to hold space for anyone who's having a challenging psychedelic journey. And so I was told about Zendo and immediately registered to be trained with Zendo, and to learn how to handle that kind of experience if somebody else who's with me is going into that kind of place. And I have to say, it's come in useful about no less than 24 times. And
wow,
it's shocking that, especially because then I became known in my community as the Zendo guy, the guy who could help if there was somebody over on the other side of the party or the whatever experience we might be having, who was going into more challenging psychedelic episode. And so then I would be called to hold space for them, which is a huge honor, and finding that actually implementing some of the faculties that Zendo teaches can rapidly bring somebody to a space of grounding and centeredness, and seeing them sort of come from this very lost traumatic response into a place of potentially healing and at least very sort of learning something from the experience is an incredible tool set to be able to bring to the community. So I highly recommend anyone who's interested in being in the psychedelic ecosystem, that Zendo is a great place to look for further training in that area.
Wow. What a cool story. And you've sold me. I'm going to check them out. I've heard of them loosely, but I may have to do a deeper dive and maybe join, because that sounds like something that could be very useful. I loved your story about the intention setting and the importance of it. I found it's become a must-have ritual for all my psychedelic use, so much so, and it's been so effective that I only take 2 bowl hits of cannabis a week. That's my current structure. And now, even before I take a bowl hit, I'll set an intention. It could be something as simple as, I will be happy and funny and in the moment by taking this bowl hit. And it's incredible how often it works. And I think with psychedelics, there is nothing on earth as subjective and as personal and as transcendent from the substance than psychedelics. And you've got to have that right set and setting. You have to have the right intention. And I think, to your point, this concept of losing horizontal spatial relations reminds me of when you're on psychedelics, oftentimes, especially in a deeper journey, it's almost as if you are a 10-year-old. You have the faculties and the ability to handle adversity of a 10-year-old. So use the same discretion that you would for your 10-year-old child or your 10-year-old cousin. Don't put them in situations that could be traumatic or difficult, and treat yourself the same way as you are on a harder session or a deeper session. And which kind of dovetails well to my next question, which is knowing that, I mean, there's a lot of good things that come from being a 10-year-old in a way. There's so much more wonder and awe, and you have the ability to kind of take in more of reality instead of the adult kind of consciousness sometimes, where it's a flashlight. The child consciousness is almost like a lantern, and psychedelics open that up. And having said that, even with my many sessions, David, I'm still a little bit scared going into every session. And that's probably one of the more challenging parts for me going into it. And I'm curious, as you approach your intentional psychedelic use, what's one of the challenges that you still face?
Well, I became a father in the last year, and
congratulations.
Thank you. I have a little coronial baby, and it's been—
What's that?
A coronial baby, a baby born during Corona.
Oh.
It's the coronial generation.
Okay.
So I've completely transformed without even putting effort into that or knowing it would happen. The sense of responsibility and the sense of how important it is that I'm present, I'm resourced, I'm in this to be as strong as possible so that my child Savannah can be as great as possible. And that really shifted the perspective on why I may or may not use psychedelics. I've actually only had 1 or 2 journeys, I think, since she was born a year and a half ago, and they've been incredibly well-intentioned, in the right container, knowing that I was in a safe place where friends could hold me if anything were to happen. But what's interesting is that the experience of the trip was a fraction of what it might have been on the same dosage before having a baby. And so I think that there's this natural paternal instinct to stay in control, if you will. And I know control has mixed applications, but being at least present enough that if anything were to happen or to get a phone call that I was needed or anything, I would absolutely be able to completely ground and get there. And
sure.
It happened once before when I was in my late 20s. I had a partner who was type 1 diabetic, and there was an episode where we were both enjoying ourselves. We were actually at a small festival in upstate New York, and we were both on acid. And we suddenly realized 4 hours in, right at the peak, that she didn't bring her insulin with her for her insulin pump. And it's pretty critical for any type 1 diabetic to have that on hand if anything should go wrong. And her blood sugar was starting to affect her state of mind, and we needed to get to the nearest pharmacy and get insulin. And the same thing happened where I had been fully in the throes of a psychedelic experience, and with all of the visuals and the emotions to it, and it was wonderful, but it needed to stop in that moment in order for me to get myself together, order a car, get out of to the nearest neighborhood, and essentially get medicines she needed. Yeah, but really it showed me that it is possible. Our minds are really powerful, and I think, I used to practice and study hypnosis. I was just fascinated by hypnosis in my early 20s. And I learned that one can really only be induced into a hypnotic state if they want to, on some subconscious level. And hypnotists know this, that if somebody really wants to prove that they can't be hypnotized, they won't be. And if somebody's somewhat open to what might come, then that they can, anything can be induced. And I think that's the same with psychedelics. I think there's this natural desire we all have to alter our states, and to, it's something that's existed in more or less every culture around the world for millennia, that both humans and animals will find some kind of often plant-based way to alter their state of consciousness and alter their experience. I mean, even young children spinning around in circles very quickly and then getting dizzy and feeling what it's like to be dizzy. It's a natural inclination. And I think most of us at least, have that desire to surrender to the psychedelic. But also it's powerful to know that our minds are strong and we can center when we need to. And that's often what's best if we're going into a really dark space and we're not resourced enough to process whatever trauma might be coming up, which is also a natural part of these journeys. So I like to, you asked a question about how I set intention or prepare for these kinds of experiences now. And I think it's dancing in that space of how much do I want to surrender and release, because there can be incredible benefits for me personally, versus how much do I want to stay grounded and stay present so that I can be there for my family and others around me.
I appreciate the subtlety and texture of that, because maybe right now, as you have a 1-year-old, maybe it's just not time for you to go super deep, and your internal compass is telling you, no, go 1 foot in, but maybe not all the way, because when you are all the way, you're in a different dimension, and something is happening that you're not aware of the current spatial environment in your human avatar. So maybe it's just an evolution. Maybe in some time when Savannah gets a little bit older, or it's a little more stable, or you're in a spot where you're, miles and miles away or somewhere, then it's appropriate. But sometimes going deep isn't the thing. And speaking of that, it does happen, as we both know. And I think perhaps the only reason you've known that there is a depth that you can go to when you fully let go is because you've been to those depths. And I'm curious to kind of dive into the ineffable space a little bit, David, of a profound mystical experience. For me, I had one where, kind of goes without saying, this is all very difficult to describe, but one of the profound experiences I had was my existence and my frame of reality was stripped down to the core, to the metal, to such an extent that as I started to build back up, and as I started to kind of collapse back into being a human, I felt almost unhuman, to the point where it was as if I felt like this idea of a human is just an idea. And at the core of it, I am just an organism. I am an organism that has manifested from plants almost to the result that I am just a walking, talking plant. And I'm not even really a human. That's just a story we tell ourselves. And that framework might sound kind of silly to the uninitiated, but that framework of seeing myself as just a very advanced walking, talking plant fundamentally changed the way my viewpoint, fundamentally changed my relationship with nature. And I'm so grateful for that experience. And I'm curious, what is a psychedelic mystical experience you can recall?
One of the most beautiful moments was being in a dance with my partner, Lana, in the first couple of years of us being together. And both of us just were sort of melting into each other. We were slow dancing and suddenly my field of vision looked very different. And what I was seeing, what I was seeing was our DNA and our DNA communicating. And that hasn't happened before, but I think there's something fascinating there. I don't, that view would spontaneously appear. Hard to put it into better words than that. Ineffable is the right way of describing these things. I'll share another one because I think it's actually an important part of my personal journey. I had started smoking when I was in my late teens, early 20s. Started smoking cigarettes and moved to New York and found that smoking was a great way to meet people in the smoking area, outside bars, that kind of thing. And then moved on to the Juul. So I smoked cigarettes for about 6 years, and then the Juul for 4 years, the vape pen. So 10 years of nicotine fairly constantly in my system. And I was starting to feel that there was something that might be unhealthy about this. I had been in denial about that for a while, and then started to feel in my body and in my lungs that this was maybe not the best for me, but I just didn't have the headspace to try and quit. I wasn't necessarily putting that intention out there, but it was in the back of my mind that I should really quit. And then I was in this experience where I had taken mushrooms and had a really beautiful day with a couple of friends in Mexico. And all of a sudden, I was mid-conversation. I was fairly lucid. It wasn't a particularly strong trip. I was in conversation with my partner, Lana. And all of a sudden, again, my field of view went internal. And what I was looking at as a sort of outside observer was the constituents of my makeup, my psychology, if you will. And this is what it felt like, with these sort of amorphous humanoid figures that were about 12 of them gathered around a round table. And they were essentially convening a meeting of the board, if you will, to discuss whether the nicotine molecule was needed in the system of David Champion, which was fascinating. Again, I didn't read about some technique that I was practicing or anything like that. It was totally spontaneous. And it was fairly quick, lasted about 10 minutes. And they had this discussion and the debate, and then the hammer was down and the decision was final that nicotine was no longer needed. And I suddenly, that view disappeared, and I felt this black smoke literally depart. Well, not literally, but I imagined this black smoke departing my body. And it just felt so different. I almost felt like my cells were cleaner, and I had no interest. I actually had a Juul in my hand because I had been smoking it right before that. So the Juul e-cig, I gave it away and didn't smoke a single puff again for 2 years or something. And
wow.
It's just incredible that that's been, and now that's been validated. I actually had a wonderful conversation with Dick Schwartz, who's the creator of internal family systems, which is where they do parts work, and this idea of your different parts inside us all, the different parts that make up our psychology, and that there is actually a technique that's very similar to that, but I wasn't aware of that at the time. So quite interesting that an addiction could be overcome overnight by the use of psychedelics, and there's plenty of research validating that, but I think there's still a lot of skepticism about it in the public. And I'll just be one advocate sharing a story that it does happen. And psychedelics are, especially psilocybin, which is non-addictive. It's incredible to imagine that cigarettes are legal and sort of used widely as part of society, and psilocybin, which is not even addictive and so much healthier, is outlawed by society. So I'm hopeful that we're seeing the paradigm change there, and the tides are shifting.
The tides are certainly shifting, and what an incredible story. Thank you for that share. This idea of the personal board meeting inside yourself, and the fact that you weren't really in a deep session. You were having a conversation, but all of a sudden the visual field was taken over. It's incredibly powerful, and it's amazing to hear how it was as if, well, one, this black smoke lifting and kind of escaping your body. But the fact that it was for you, it felt like such an unassailable decision where you didn't really have it. It wasn't a decision. You saw this kind of discussion happen. And as the gavel got slammed, you just agreed. You were like, no, that's the thing now. And I think, wow, that's powerful. And it kind of reminds me of Jim Fadiman, his book, Symphony of Selves. He wrote the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. Symphony of Selves talks about, we have a bunch of internal personalities up here, different layers, and that have evolved over the years. And sometimes there's a few of them. And I believe I have a few. There's a dinner party up in my head that sometimes I feel like a crazy person, but it sounds like you kind of saw that on a visceral level. And wow, what a good share. So switching gears a little bit, David, imagine this internal David board of directors has a decision on psilocybin. Imagine you are the drug czar and you get to decide what happens for, let's say, US, Canada, and Europe. How would you approach the question of legalization or decriminalization or something else? What would be your thought process?
It's a big question. Well, I believe in localization, and I'm a big fan of any systems that allow local communities to decide what's best for them rather than having some kind of top-down forced function on how people live life. And one of the ideas that I've been inspired by in Denver is this concept that there would be hyperlocal neighborhood co-ops where there would be a physical grow operation for growing naturally derived psilocybin. And then there would be a ceremonial space, or sort of the ability for the community to gather for ceremonies or for therapy or for different forms of psychedelic work. And then there would be also a safe space that could be a room or a couple of rooms where anyone who's having a challenging part of their journey could receive coaching, therapy, or grounding of some sort. And just having that facility be available for every neighborhood, whether it's Black or brown or immigrant or local or trans BIPOC. I think that there's different needs and desires for every single collective of humans, and we naturally self-organize into these different groups and tribes, if you will. So why not have the facilities be available to us hyper personalized to those tribes? And I'm talking to one individual who's very, very wise in this space, and one of his desires is that if he's going to psilocybin therapy or psilocybin hosted experience, that the guide be also a homosexual man, since that's the orientation for him. And these kind of things are harder to find when legislation is pushed from a federal level downwards, and a blanket assumption or statement is made for the country. So I think that's one interesting approach. I also think it's very important that we create systems of access and affordability for more communities. This is something we're working extremely heavily on, and finding ways of cultivating an entire ecosystem where those that have, i.e. corporations that are doing research to help cultivate psychedelic practices, psychedelic medicines, insurance provisions, that kind of thing, are able to pay more into the system, and then that's redistributed to the folks who can't even afford a single session with a therapist, for example. So access, very, very important. And on top of that, measurement. And this is, of course, our specialty, and it's natural that this is where I would put the emphasis of my answer, but we really have to start measuring what's happening. And a great analogy that Daniel Barron writes about is that there was a time where you would walk into a doctor's office and they would need to find out your weight, for example, so they could assess whether you've been gaining weight since the last visit, and they would essentially look at you and write down whether they thought you were heavier or lighter than the last visit. And then the scales were introduced, right? Same thing with the stethoscope for measuring somebody's heart rate. We have technology that can allow the practitioners of health and wellness to measure whether somebody is making progress in a positive direction, and if not, then what can be done differently. And those aren't being applied too much in psychedelic work. I think there's a lot of resistance for understandable reasons. I totally get that these are sacred, ineffable, naturally derived experiences. And in society, we've been engaging with plant medicines for millennia. And I totally understand that that's at a discord with devices and screens and technology and even the priming that can come from measurement. I totally understand that. And my current outlook is that there's no way for us to bring really reliable, safe, effective psychedelic healing to everyone on the planet without first measuring which practices are working and which ones aren't working well enough. And if we can start to create that measurement as a mindset throughout society in psychedelics, I think we'll start to be able to see what's working the best and what works best for which type of people or which individual person. And then can we bring those best practices to more people so that there doesn't have to be this stigma? Because the only reason there's stigma around psychedelics outside of politics is because enough people have used them without the proper technologies. Without the proper education and awareness and clarity on how to engage psychedelics well. And with the community that's gathering around the psychedelic movement, I think there's an unprecedented opportunity for us to engage in these experiences safely and show that it is possible to resolve the mental health crisis that we're in right now. So it's a big answer to a big question, and there's more I could say, but I'll leave that for another show.
I appreciate that. And I think you're right. It's time to stop eyeballing mental health. And we're at a point now where the psychedelic renaissance is coming. And just as we start to have technology that can really track the nuance of mental health and wellness. So what a time to be alive. David, producer Kevin is giving me the wave. We got to go to the soul search. But before we do, really quickly, what are you excited about? What's the one thing you're very excited about for Maya coming up in the near future?
Very, very excited to be partnering with the National Psychedelic Association. And in this collaboration with that incredible group, we'll be bringing Maya to the state of Oregon. And it's our goal to help equip all of the retreats and clinics and practitioners in Oregon who will be opening their doors to help facilitate psilocybin experiences with the tools that hopefully help them to create the best possible practices, to learn from each other, to sort of empower their patients and clients with the best psychedelic journeys possible. And I think that's going to create an incredible case study for how other states can then embrace psychedelics safely.
That's wonderful. Partnership with the National Psychedelic Association and working with Oregon. Stay tuned on that. That is very exciting. I kind of want to see how that develops as well. So we got to switch gears to the speed round soul search, David. So David, question number 1. You get to relive the life of any historical figure. Who you got?
I think it would be fascinating to have been one of the Roman emperors. I can't say I know enough how to choose which one, but one of the, this explosive growth of the Roman Empire throughout Europe must have been such an exciting period of time with the innovation and technology and engineering. So that's what comes to mind first.
Oh, that's good. I don't know if it's synchronicity, but I'm reading The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and it breaks down a few pages on each emperor, and you may like it. Just don't choose Caligula, or maybe that is the move. I don't know. I like that answer though. Question number 2, David, a little bit easier. What is your favorite book and your favorite movie?
Favorite book is A New Earth by, have you heard of this book? Eckhart Tolle. I could not recommend it more for the audience. A New Earth. And I've read it over 20 times and find some new wisdom in there each time.
Wow.
And then favorite movie, Weekend at Bernie's.
Okay, I'm going to check out that book. Question number 3, David. Are we in a simulation?
Hard to say. The truth is, I think if we were, it wouldn't be anything like the VR simulations that we're creating now. So it's quite exciting to imagine what that might look like. And it's also comforting in a way to imagine that we're all safe if we're just in a simulation. But I can't say I've landed on an answer for that philosophically.
That's fair. It's a tough question. Okay, last question, number 4. David, who is the one person that you would like to trip with that you haven't already?
Always my partner that I haven't already. Darren Brown. Darren Brown is one of my 12 dinner guests, and maybe he'll listen to this show and receive the invitation through you, Ray. But he's been a source of inspiration for me since I was in my teens, and I've learned so much from him. For anyone who doesn't know, he's a British mentalist, one of the people I think understands the most about human psychology in the world.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'll have to check him out. This has been a wealth of information in this soul search. Okay, David, really quickly before we jump, where can the viewers find you?
Well, my email is david@mayahealth.com, the website MAYA health.com, Maya Health, and would love everyone here to check it out. It's very, very exciting what we're bringing to this psychedelic ecosystem. And through there, we have a newsletter. We have great social content that we're posting all the time. You can find the links to those on our website as well.
David, you have a sharp team. Your website, by the way, the design aesthetic is gorgeous, a cool product. I've seen it firsthand. And you are really one of the true innovators, and I think a philosopher king in this space. And I think we're all lucky to have you in this space and pushing the needle further. Thank you so much for joining the show.
I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you as well to producer Kevin. I am Ray Christian. That's all the time we have for this episode of the Psychedelic Diaries. See you next time.
Who could have thought I'd get you?